A boat is a raft, is an oil drum. Reading by Jeffrey K. Jones. Illustrations by Michael B. Jones.
Oh, very young, what will you leave us this time? You're only dancing on this earth for a short while. And though your dreams may toss and turn you now, they will vanish away like your dad's best.
In the summer of 2007, during a family vacation in Michigan, my brother Mike and I drove by one of our former homes. We had always talked about taking a trip down memory lane, and this was our first opportunity to do so. As we walked to the top of the berm behind the old house, the memories flooded back. 1990s, 1980s, 1970s.
I wanna go home. I wanna go home. Oh, I wanna go home.
It was the summer of 1972. I was 14 and my brother Mike was but 9. My family lived in a small rented duplex on White Lake Road in Clarkston, Michigan. White Lake Road was a narrow gravel road that snaked its way over and around the small hills that surrounded the many other lakes along the same road before actually getting to White Lake. We lived in front of an unnamed lake sandwiched between Crosby Lake and Robinson Lake. The area is much the same today, although the lake is smaller and there has been extensive residential development since then. Stating that the house was small is quite an understatement. It was even smaller than my memory had led me to believe. A grown man can stand at the back door, the one that we used all the time, and look straight onto the shed-type roof that covers the kitchen, and he would have to duck and step down to enter. While we lived there, all of the interior walls, with the exception of the demising wall between the two sides, were covered with pressboard instead of the traditional drywall or plaster. The galley kitchen was cramped and could not accommodate all of us eating at the same time. The two small bedrooms that 6 of us siblings shared were accessed by the narrow staircase in the center of the house. When we moved into the house, the lingering odor of kerosene and soot that emanated from the pot-bellied stove that sat in the living room was invasive throughout the whole place. You can believe that Mom made sure the house received a good scrubbing on move-in day. The house resembled a deluxe ice shanty more than it did a home. Even though our last house had been large, 6 bedrooms with all the fixings, our family adjusted easily to our new digs. To borrow an expression from my brother Mike, this was not the first time that we had gone from champ to chump. However, what the interior lacked was more than made up for by the immense exterior surroundings that became our playground. The house itself sat on a relatively small lot that backed up to a tall berm. There was a well-worn, though overgrown path that wound its way to the top. Once at the top, one had a full view of the somewhat horseshoe-shaped lake that sat a full 60 feet below. The lake side of the berm was much steeper than the house side and seemed to be an almost sheer drop. The path continued along the length of the berm and gradually flattened out when it reached the reeds and cattails of the soggy marsh that served as a backwater to this medium-sized lake. In our backyard, directly behind and perpendicular to the house, sat an old school bus. Its yellow paint and school markings faded by Father Time. Not as large as the buses of the day, but larger than a minibus. It was an old International, I think, late 40s or early 50s vintage. Most of the seats had long since lost their coverings, and the weeds had exploited every crack in the steel floorboard to create quite a formidable jungle inside. The windows and the swing-arm door still worked perfectly, though. I spent many hours driving that old bus, picking up many passengers along the way. Mike was the most regular. He and I hung out together all the time. Also in the backyard, in the same general vicinity as the bus, was an old abandoned horizontal ice cream freezer. The well-worn Borden stickers affixed to the sides, barely legible. It was a big commercial style, with 8 back-to-back doors in the top, 4 on each side. This stainless steel prize served equally well as both tank and submarine, depending upon the imaginary situation, of course. However, our greatest find was attached to the back of the house. Sitting there on its bent, rusting legs was the treasure Mike and I had been seeking. A 275-gallon basement-type oil drum. You see, we knew that our family could ill afford to acquire a boat, canoe, or any other type of flotation device that we could use to explore the lake, and we had been searching for a suitable substitute. We also knew that if our family followed our normal pattern, we wouldn't be living there when the cold wind started to blow and the drum might be needed again. In fact, the oil drum seemed useless to us in its current configuration. But with a little imagination and some inventive tinkering, it would make a fine raft. Everyone knows that a raft isn't much good if it's not in the water, though, and there lie our first challenge: how to get it from its current location up and over the berm so that we could give it a proper launching ceremony at the water's edge. After a brief strategy session, we determined that because of the large flat sides and the basic oval shape inherent in this style of oil drum, it would easily roll anywhere that we wanted it to. After a few minutes with our makeshift tools, our raft was in perfect position to begin the big move. We had drawn an imaginary line across the yard directly to the center of the upward path. Mike and I were confident that once we got it rolling, the oil drum would surely have enough momentum to help us carry it straight to the top of the berm. Ah, for the plans of mice and men, and boys and oil drums. My goodness, our idea had worked about as well as brushing a coat of paint on an ice cube. Not too good. What we had failed to consider during our strategy session was the possibility that the oil drum might actually contain some oil. The 12-inch filler tube was never discussed either. Well, both of these unthought-of conditions made our oil drum much harder to roll than we had imagined it would be. We would roll it one way, then the other, and just when it seemed that we were making progress, thud! That darn old filler tube. After trying this approach several times, making little headway, we came to a conclusion. We needed a better plan. Our better plan consisted of me, in essence, becoming a mule. Using a crude harness that we had made from reclaimed clothesline, I pulled from the front while Mike pushed for all he could from the back. I still don't see how Mike could have been doing much pushing while yelling, "Yah, mule," every few seconds. Although that part of Michigan certainly is no Mojave Desert, it isn't Antarctica either. Man, was it hot. One or two attempts at this convinced us that it was time for Plan C. Our new problem was that we didn't have a Plan C. We had already invested a great deal of time and energy trying to launch our raft, and neither of us was willing to quit. Besides, we didn't think Mom would have appreciated us abandoning the oil drum in the middle of the yard. Mom hadn't exactly been taken with the idea that 2 of her sons wanted to push their way around the lake on a raft. An oil drum, for God's sake. She recognized the obvious dangers associated with such an activity and emphatically shared her concerns with us. Nevertheless, Mom was also the product of a different time. When she was a child, kids relied more on their imaginations and less on toys to amuse themselves. Considering that toys in her family were in short supply, it had been a necessity. I think that she was cautiously proud of us, though, because we were using our imaginations to full effect. Mike and I had begged and pleaded with her long enough to convince ourselves that she had succumbed to the idea. Kind of. Having hit a temporary impasse on how to move our oil drum, we thought that it was a good time for some Kool-Aid and a bologna sandwich. It's funny how a little food and a cool drink can reinvigorate a young mind. Of course, Mom's last words to us on the subject, which came during lunch, "Get that oil drum out of the yard," helped too. Coming up with Plan C was imperative. What to do? We didn't know just then, but we did know that it couldn't be long before Plan C had to go into full operation. Back at our oil drum, a few minutes of quiet contemplation and the somewhat distant whine of a neighbor boy's dirt bike sowed the seeds of Plan C. This lanky boy of about 11 or 12 years old, whose hero evidently was Evel Knievel, was always bragging about how his Harley 50cc is the best bike in the world. He could do anything with it. We didn't like this boy much because he was a show-off. Not liking someone, though, is not reason enough to be unneighborly. With all the interest and congeniality one would expect of a good neighbor, and the schemes of two desperate boys running through our minds, we hiked over toward the pea gravel hill he was attempting to climb. After engaging in light conversation for a minute or two, as I knew it would, the bragging began. Having recently heard Mom read Tom Sawyer on our weekly family reading night, I think that Mike and I concluded at about the same time that this could be an opportunity to replicate the infamous fence whitewashing scenario. It wasn't as hard as I had thought it would be to challenge him to pull our oil drum to the top of the berm. In fact, I bet him my slightly used target bow and arrow set that he couldn't do it. I forgot to tell him that I already lost all of the arrows somewhere over the berm. He leapt at the challenge and quickly followed us to where our future raft lay in wait. Using the same reclaimed clothesline that I had only recently shed, Mike and I fashioned a towing harness for his bike, attaching it to the rear shocks of the little bike that could. Emulating his hero as best he could, our neighbor boy mustered his courage and let it fly. His first attempt failed miserably. He too had failed to consider that the oil drum might be heavier than anticipated. Upon picking himself up and dusting off, he was ready to quit. I don't think that the fact Mike and I were laughing our heads off helped much either. It took some quick apologies, a sweetened bet, and an offer to push while he pulled to convince him to try again. We took our positions at the rear of the drum while he revved up. This time he let us clutch out more gradually than before. With him crouched low over the handlebars, the throttle wide open, Mike and I pushing as hard as we could while also spitting away the dirt that was flying all around our heads, she started to move. "Go, go," we yelled. Straining with all that we had, the three of us pushed, pulled, and dragged that old oil drum until at last we reached the summit. Drained from the effort, we all three collapsed to the ground and lay in the shadow of the long side of the drum. The earth was cool and the life-giving oxygen sweet. Mike and I were jubilant. Plan C had worked. Or had it?
Young boys, they all want to take us home.
Another funny thing about operations and such is that they usually have at least two parts. We had not yet considered the second part. How in the world do we now get it down to the water? First, we had to get rid of Evel Knievel. Don't get me wrong, it's not like we weren't appreciative of his effort. We were. But this was our operation, and from this point on he would merely be an unwanted distraction. Besides, he had just won a bow and arrow set, not to mention a blonde and bearded G.I. Joe. While Mike and I consulted with each other on how best to proceed, he checked his hog for damage. When he rejoined us back at the drum, I told him that we needed to check some things out and didn't plan to launch until morning. I had lied. We had every intention of seeing our raft afloat that very day. Although clearly disappointed, he accepted my explanation and rode away. Watching him go, somehow I couldn't help thinking that there went a pawn who had just been bested by a knight and a king.
In the city, hot child 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 in the city.